Florida. For generations, the name itself has been a promise, a whisper of paradise on the American continent. The Sunshine State, a land of endless summer, of swaying palm trees, of a life lived not by the calendar, but by the tides. It is the dream of escape from brutal, soul-crushing winters, from high taxes that seem to vanish into a bureaucratic void, from the relentless pressures of a life lived in the gray, cold north. It is the promise of a golden retirement, earned through a lifetime of hard work, of a vibrant new start for a young family, of a place where the cost of living is low and the quality of life is immeasurably high. Millions have answered this siren song, flocking to its shores in one of the greatest and most sustained internal migrations in American history. They come with dreams born from postcards and television shows, dreams of affordable homes with pools in the backyard, of year-round sunshine that melts away the stress, of a life that feels like a permanent vacation. And on the surface, that dream appears to be intoxicatingly real. The state's economy is booming, its cities are growing at a dizzying, almost manic pace, and entire new communities, with names that evoke tranquility and nature, sprout from the swampland and citrus groves seemingly overnight. But in 2025, that dream is beginning to curdle under the relentless, unforgiving sun. Beneath the shimmering, postcard-perfect facade, a different, darker reality is taking hold. The very forces that have made Florida so alluring, its explosive growth, its low-tax, business-friendly ethos, and its unique and exquisitely fragile environment, have converged to create a perfect storm of crises. The paradise is becoming a paradox, a place where the dream of a better life is colliding with the harsh, often brutal realities of a state on the brink. This is not a story you will see on the tourism brochures. This is the story that lies behind the manufactured smiles and the perfect sunsets. This is the story you need to hear before you pack your bags, sell your home, and join the exodus. Before you move to Florida, watch this.
The first and most immediate shock that greets new arrivals is the brutal, disorienting reality of the Florida housing market. The long-held myth of Florida as a bastion of affordability, a place where a middle-class income could still secure a comfortable home, has been utterly shattered. The same pandemic-fueled migration that supercharged its population growth also poured gasoline on its real estate market, transforming it into a speculative frenzy that has left locals reeling. The state has become a playground for institutional investors, faceless Wall Street firms, and out-of-state cash buyers, who have waged a relentless bidding war that has pushed the dream of homeownership far out of reach for ordinary working families. In cities across the state, from the gleaming glass and steel towers of Miami to the once sleepy, family-friendly suburbs of Orlando and Tampa, the median home price has exploded, rising at a pace that has left local wages, which have barely budged, in the dust. A modest 1970s-era concrete block house, the very symbol of Florida's middle class that would have sold for $250,000 just a few years ago, is now fetching upwards of $500,000, often in frenzied all-cash deals that local, mortgage-dependent buyers simply cannot compete with. The stories are everywhere, whispered in grocery store aisles and lamented in local diners. Teachers, nurses, and firefighters, the very backbone of any functioning community, are finding themselves priced out of the very towns they serve, forced into grueling, multi-hour, soul-crushing commutes from the ever-expanding faceless exurbs that now sprawl for miles across the state's interior. But the sticker price of the home is only the beginning of the nightmare. The true crisis, the one that is pushing hundreds of thousands of Floridians to the financial brink, is the implosion of the state's property insurance market. Florida's unique geography, a low-lying peninsula jutting out into the warm, volatile waters of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, makes it the single most vulnerable state in the nation to hurricanes and flooding. As climate change makes these storms more frequent, more powerful, and more destructive, the private insurance industry, driven by global reinsurance markets and sophisticated risk modeling algorithms, has begun a full-scale panicked retreat, Dozens of insurance companies have gone insolvent or have simply stopped writing new policies in the state altogether. For homeowners, the consequences have been catastrophic. Annual insurance premiums have doubled, tripled, or in some cases quadrupled in a single year, transforming from a manageable, predictable expense into a second and often larger mortgage. It is not uncommon for a family to see their insurance bill jump from a manageable $3,000 a year to an impossible $10,000, $15,000, or even $20,000 a year with no end in sight. Many are now finding that they can no longer get private insurance at all, forced onto the state's insurer of last resort, Citizens Property Insurance. This entity, which was designed to be a temporary safety net for a small number of uninsurable homes, has now swelled to become the largest insurer in the state, a clear and terrifying sign of a market in total, systemic collapse. This has created a new, tragic class of insurance refugees, people who are being forced to sell their homes not because they can't afford the mortgage, but because they can't afford the impossible cost of protecting it from the very storms that are an inescapable part of life on this peninsula. And it is not just the hurricanes. The rising sea levels, a slow motion, and irreversible crisis are beginning to take their toll. In coastal communities up and down the state, from the Florida Keys to Miami Beach to St. Petersburg, sunny day flooding has become a regular disruptive occurrence. On days with no rain, during simple high tides, seawater now pushes up through the state's porous limestone bedrock, inundating streets, overwhelming drainage systems, and corroding the foundations of homes and businesses. This is a problem that no seawall can fix, a fundamental geological reality that threatens to render vast swaths of the state's most valuable and iconic real estate uninhabitable within a generation. To buy a home in many parts of South Florida today is to make a terrifying bet against the inexorable forces of both the market and the climate, a gamble with stakes that are almost too high to comprehend. The Florida dream was once a single-family home with a pool. For many, it is now a precarious existence in an overpriced apartment, paying a rent that consumes over 50% of their income with the constant, gnawing fear of the next rent hike or the next approaching storm.
The second pillar of the Florida myth is its reputation as a low-tax haven, a place where you can keep more of your hard-earned money. And it is true that Florida has no state income tax, a fact trumpeted in every promotional brochure and shouted from every political podium. But this is a seductive and deeply misleading part of the sales pitch. The state has to generate revenue somehow, and it does so through a regressive and often brutal system of property taxes, sales taxes, and a dizzy and inescapable array of fees that place a disproportionate burden on the poor and the middle class. The explosive rise in home values has triggered an equally explosive rise in property tax bills. Because the state constitution limits how much the taxable value of a primary residence can increase each year, new homebuyers are hit with a welcome stranger tax shock, often paying property taxes that are 2 or 3 times higher than their next-door neighbor who has lived there for decades. Families who have owned their homes for years are now facing annual tax bills that have doubled or tripled, a crippling expense that is forcing many, especially retirees on fixed incomes, out of the very homes they have spent their lives paying off. But the hidden costs don't stop there. Florida's heavy reliance on sales tax means that every purchase, from a gallon of milk to a new t-shirt for a growing child, is taxed, a system that by its very nature hits lower-income families the hardest, as they spend a much larger percentage of their income on basic goods. And then there are the fees. The state has perfected the art of the user fee, a hidden, insidious tax on nearly every aspect of daily life. Toll roads are ubiquitous, a spiderweb of asphalt that can turn a simple commute into a daily drain on your bank account. The fees for vehicle registration, for a driver's license, for a fishing license, for simply accessing a state park for an afternoon, all are among the highest in the nation. This is the great bait and switch of the Florida tax system. You are lured in by the promise of no state income tax, only to find yourself bled dry by 1,000 smaller cuts, a system deliberately designed to favor the wealthy who derive most of their income from untaxed capital gains at the expense of the working families who are the engine of the state's service-based economy.
The promise of a better life in Florida is also colliding with the harsh reality of a state whose infrastructure is buckling under the weight of its own relentless, often unplanned and chaotic growth. The state's transportation system is a case study in systemic failure. In every major metropolitan area, from the sprawling interchanges of Miami to the clogged arteries of Orlando and the gridlocked bridges of Jacksonville, residents are trapped in a state of perpetual gridlock, enduring some of the longest and most soul-crushing commutes in the nation. The state's addiction to endless, low-density suburban sprawl has created a car-dependent society with almost no viable public transportation options, a system that is not just inefficient and environmentally disastrous, but also a profound tax on the time, the wallets, and the mental health of its citizens. The very water that makes Florida a paradise is also the source of one of its most pressing and existential crises. Decades of underinvestment in water management, combined with the immense pressures of overdevelopment and the nutrient-rich runoff from its vast agricultural industry, have created a looming ecological catastrophe. The state's iconic waterways, the fragile ecosystem of the Everglades, the once pristine Indian River Lagoon, the crystal-clear springs of the interior, are being choked to death by toxic algae blooms, fueled by a poisonous cocktail of nutrient pollution from aging septic tanks, lawn fertilizer, and overwhelmed sewer systems. These red tides and blue-green algae blooms are not just an eyesore, they are a public health crisis, killing off marine life by the ton, sickening residents with respiratory illnesses, and devastating the tourism and fishing industries that are the lifeblood of many coastal communities. The pristine beaches and sparkling waters that draw millions to the state are becoming increasingly hazardous, a tragic and potent symbol of a paradise that is slowly poisoning itself from within. The Florida dream was also a promise of a high quality of life, of a place where you could not just live, but truly thrive. But for many, that promise is being broken by a social infrastructure that is failing to keep pace with the state's explosive growth. Florida's public education system, starved of resources by a political class obsessed with tax cuts and embroiled in endless culture wars, consistently ranks among the worst in the nation in terms of per-pupil spending and teacher pay. Overcrowded classrooms, underpaid and demoralized teachers fleeing the profession in droves, and a constant, politically driven battle over curriculum have created a system in crisis. For families moving to the state with children, the dream of a good education often requires navigating a complex and competitive system of charter and magnet schools or paying for expensive private schools, adding yet another layer of financial strain to an already unaffordable cost of living. The healthcare system is similarly strained. While the state boasts some world-class hospitals in its major urban centers, for many residents, particularly in its vast rural and working-class communities, access to quality, affordable healthcare is a constant and often desperate struggle. Florida is one of the handful of states that has steadfastly refused to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, leaving hundreds of thousands of its poorest working residents in a cruel coverage gap. Too poor to afford private insurance, but not considered poor enough to qualify for traditional Medicaid. This has created a system where routine illness can become a financial catastrophe, where preventative care is a luxury that many simply cannot afford, and where a trip to the emergency room can result in a lifetime of crippling debt. And then there is the intangible, but perhaps most profound challenge of life in the new Florida, the erosion of community. The state's growth has been so rapid, so transient, and so driven by outside speculation that it has often failed to create the deep, organic sense of community that defines older, more established parts of the country. Many of the new suburban developments are vast, anonymous landscapes of identical, beige houses, governed by strict, often draconian, homeowner associations that legislate conformity and discourage the kind of spontaneous social interaction that builds strong, resilient neighborhoods. The population is a constantly churning mix of new arrivals, seasonal snowbirds who come and go with the weather, and millions of tourists, creating a culture that can feel transient, disconnected, and impermanent. The sense of shared history and common purpose that binds a community together is often absent, replaced by a more individualistic and transactional ethos.
This is not to say that strong, vibrant communities do not exist in Florida. They do, often in the older, more established neighborhoods that are now under the greatest threat from gentrification. But for many new arrivals, the search for a sense of belonging, for a place that truly feels like home, can be a long, isolating, and lonely one. The final reckoning. So, what does this all mean? It means that the Florida of the postcards, the Florida of the national imagination, is a dangerous and seductive oversimplification. It is a state of profound and often brutal contradictions. It is a land of incredible, breathtaking natural beauty that is being systematically poisoned by its own growth. It is a low-tax haven that is becoming crushingly unaffordable for the middle class. It is a booming economy that is creating a new and permanent class of working poor. To move to Florida in 2025 is to step into this paradox. It is to accept a series of high-stakes, life-altering gambles. A gamble on the housing market, a gamble on the insurance market, a gamble on the climate, and a gamble on the very future of the American dream. The promise of an easy life in the sun has been replaced by the reality of a hard-fought daily battle for survival in a state where the costs are hidden and the risks are rising every single day. This is not to say that a good life is impossible in Florida. For the independently wealthy, for the remote worker with a six-figure salary from a job in another state, for the retiree who has sold an expensive home in the Northeast and can buy with cash, Florida can still be a paradise. But for the average American family, for the teacher, the nurse, the construction worker, the hospitality worker, the very people who make the state function, the dream is becoming a trap. The great unraveling of Florida is a warning. It is a glimpse into a future where the fundamental components of a stable life, a secure home, a decent wage, a sense of community, a healthy environment, are no longer rights to be earned through hard work, but privileges to be purchased by a shrinking and increasingly isolated elite. The story of Florida is the story of America in microcosm, a story of a promise that is being broken. One unaffordable home, one uninsurable risk, one shattered dream at a time. The sunshine is still here, but in its harsh, unrelenting, and unforgiving glare, the cracks in the foundation are becoming impossible to ignore.